Hello, friends, and welcome to this podcast. I talk about records, I hold up records and talk about them. Today I'm going to talk about musicians, specifically musicians who play an instrument called a guitar. A guitar is used in a lot of popular music. You may have heard of them. This is what they look like. This is a purple sparkly example. It has a whole bunch of strings, like a lot of strings, and usually they only have less than that, maybe half as many. But this one has that many. This is the neck of the guitar. This is the body of the guitar. These are the pickups that pick up the sound when you play the strings. Okay. Now that we know that, I want to talk about some guitar players that I really like. There's a lot of, you'll look at Rolling Stone or whatever, there's a lot of talk about the top 100 best guitar players, the top 5, the top 10. Number 1 is always a certain few handful of people. It's either going to be Jimi Hendrix or Jimmy Page or someone. And we've all heard of, and Jeff Beck. All these people deserve their place on these lists. Even guitar players that I appreciate but don't really enjoy their music very much, I can listen. Like, for instance, Van Halen. Loved their first album, saw them on that tour when they were opening for bands, and was completely blown away by the rock and rollness of Van Halen. Just really loved that first album. Sort of lost interest along the way, but there's no denying that Eddie Van Halen is a masterful guitar player with the tapping and the incredible runs, the solos, the classical sounding things that sound like they're impossible for one person to be playing. But better than that, he was a great guitar part writer, and his rhythm guitar playing is fantastic. I mean, aside from the soloing stuff, he was a fantastic musician, guitar player. Likewise with Jimmy Page, Brian May, Eddie Van Halen, Jeff Beck, all those top liners that you read about. But I want to talk about some of my favorites that don't usually end up on those lists. In fact, I went through a few of those lists and I made sure that the guitar players that I really like, I really like Brian May. I could go on and on about, his early stuff in Queen, but there's some guitar players that never end up on those lists that deserve to be listened to, that really deserve your attention if you're into guitar playing. If you're in fact a guitar player, you're probably way ahead of me on this, because I think these guitar players I'm going to mention are guitar players who, if you're of a certain age and a certain inclination, certain aesthetics as far as music, you probably already know about these guitar players. But I want to talk about Dave Gregory, who was the guitar player in XTC. He and Andy Partridge both played guitar. Andy Partridge wrote and played brilliantly. But Dave Gregory, you don't hear much about him. He wasn't the front man. Andy Partridge was the attention of the band. But Dave Gregory played a lot of fantastic parts in that band, and in his later bands, he's still out there playing. Brilliant solos, brilliant parts, very musical in what he brought to that band. He did arrangements, with string arrangements and things like that. But his guitar playing, when you start to pick it out, when you listen to XTC a lot, you start to figure out who's who on there. Sort of like when you listen to the Beatles, you can kind of tell when what's the guy's name? John Lennon is playing a guitar solo, or when the other guy, George Harrison, is playing a guitar solo. You can tell the difference between them if you really get into the Beatles. Likewise with XTC, you can hear Andy Partridge's parts, and I feel like I'm probably right, I don't know, and I can hear Dave Gregory's parts, and he's a fantastic guitar player. Look up XTC, listen to the guitars. I know I've talked about a characteristic solo of his is in a song called Reel by Reel, which is on their Drums and Wires album, which I think represents what I like about his style. It's a very it's like a happy guitar solo. but it's not one of those loose kind of stream of consciousness bluesy, I'm just playing out of my heart kind of guitar solos. This is a planned, written out, worked out guitar solo. It has a melody that he very likely can still play it and play it the same way. It's a tune. It's part of the song. It fits so well in that song with the mood of the song. It's a great guitar solo, but he's got so many others to look into as well. But I'm going to move on here. Another guitar player that I really like, who may not be considered much in the guitar god realms, is Hugh Cornwell from the Stranglers. Kind of maybe a surprising choice, but when you listen to their early albums and listen to the guitar playing on there, there's a tonality to it, and there's some tone choices that were so not punk rock, so not of that time. Very unusual, unique sounds and chords, and the way he would put the chords over the songs. If you really get into that band and sort of get past because the bass guitar is right there in your face and the keyboards are in your face. The guitar playing is not necessarily up front in a lot of them, but he did do some cool melodic solos over some of their songs up through his time in the band. He played a Telecaster. The tone of that Telecaster is really apparent, and he's one of my favorite Telecaster players, and I love my Telecaster, so I'm kind of a Telecaster person. Anyway, Hugh Cornwell, Stranglers. Another band around that time that had a guitar player that doesn't get a lot of attention is Devo. Most people think of Devo as a synthesizer band. They see, guys playing keyboards, or they think of people playing keyboards, but when you go to those first several Devo albums, they're guys with guitars. They're guitars and a bass, and only one guy played keyboards, But the lead guitar player, there were two guitar players. The lead guitar player is Bob Mothersbaugh, who is the brother of Mark Mothersbaugh, who is sort of the leader of the band. He's the guy that is like the gnarly front man of that band, kind of scary. But Bob, also known as Bob One, I believe, there was two brother Bobs in the band, and they were Bob One and Bob Two. But Bob One, Bob Mothersbaugh, is a fantastic guitar player in a band that has a mechanical, sort of programmed, sequenced sound to some people's ears. But if you listen to their first album, it's a very guitar-oriented album. And what he was doing was deconstructing guitar playing, rock and roll guitar playing. He was very much rocking, whether he wants to admit it or not. Those albums rock. Sorry, but they do. They're intense. They're really fun. The music is very much guitar and bass and drums. Fantastic drummer. But his guitar playing is incredible. If you listen to the things he did, so many different types of things. He was really experimenting with sounds, and the parts he were playing echoed rock and roll types of guitar playing. But he did them in such a distorted and skewed kind of way that it was almost like he was taking that rock and roll tonality of the sort of, the Peter Gunn kind of thing and the Secret Agent Man thing, and he was twisting it just a little bit, almost like he's trying to draw attention to the artifice of it or something. There was definitely an element of performance art to Devo. That's, I think, what they primarily started out as. But his guitar playing is undeniably fantastic. Listen to his guitar stuff on things like Mr. DNA in the second Devo album, Duty Now for the Future. His solos are amazing. Blockhead guitar solo is simple but intense. Anyway, he's a classic. Really good. Kevin Shields. I think a lot of people talk about him as a guitar player in certain circles. He is the guitar player of a band called My Bloody Valentine, and he I don't know if he invented dream pop or shoegaze or whatever they call it, but that's a genre that people have labeled My Bloody Valentine, and I think it involves bands that have this sort of wash of like meditative distortion that sort of comes at you, and you feel like you're being, you're in this big blanket of tube guitar distortion, like multiple amplifiers. A big word of warning: if you ever go see them live, bring your ear hearing protection, because they are one of the loudest phenomenons on the planet Earth, I think, and very dangerously loud, I think. But some people get a sort of a transcendent teleportation effect from extreme loudness like that. So I get a little bit scared. But check out his albums. Loveless, of course, is very famous. The sounds that you hear on there are what he concentrates on. I think he does these layers of like the wall of sound idea with very carefully tuned distortion and effects on the guitar. He's not just cranking up the distortion and playing, but he's playing in a way that makes the sound of it is the effect that you get. That's the thing that is hitting you with this music. The tunes and the melodies are incredible too, very beautiful. Like almost like if you heard them played with a harpsichord, you would hear the same song in a different way. But those songs are beautiful in that way, in a kind of Baroque chamber pop-ish kind of way, aside from the vast wall of distortion. But the distortion, the sound of the music, the sound of his guitar is what keeps me sort of going back to these albums. The beautiful songs, of course, but I love to put these albums on and kind of turn it up a little bit, live dangerously a little bit here in my suburban office, And I really love the care and the care that he puts into the sound of his guitar and the effect that it has when it comes out of the speakers and hits your ears. John McGeoch. I'm hoping that's the proper way to pronounce. I've done some research. I think that's the proper way to pronounce his name. John McGeoch played in some bands in the 80s that were, I guess, considered post-punk bands because they weren't angry punk bands, but they sort of evolved out of the punk scene. He played in a band called Magazine, and he played in Susie and the Banshees, which is one of my favorites. Incredible band, very musical, very cinematic, epic band. Likewise with Magazine. And I think part of the feeling of some of their best songs comes from his guitar. He played in a way that wasn't loose and rock, like rock guitar, but he did use distortion, and he did do some heavy stuff. Some of his guitar solos are scary. He put so much drama and menace in some of the guitar solos that you hear on Magazine albums. And then you have a song like Spellbound in Susie and the Banshees, where he's doing these arpeggiated chords. He's playing these beautiful chords, and it's a complex chord structure and the chord changes. And it's one, if you're a guitar player, challenge yourself to learn the guitar part for Spellbound, and it'll be like your mind will open up to new realms as far as how to move between chords. That'll make sense to my guitar playing friends, but it's incredible. His guitar playing is incredible. Anything he was involved with, listen to his guitar playing. Elliot Easton in the Cars is another one that we don't hear too much. People don't rant and rave about Elliot Easton, but listen to the Cars, listen to all of their albums, and listen to the guitar playing on these albums. It's brilliant. I think it's upstaged a bit by the lead singer personalities that were in that band. Elliot Easton, I think, tended to sort of hang back. He wasn't like in the camera all the time. But his guitar playing is fantastic, really melodic, very musical. And he's one of those musicians in a group, in a band, who puts the work puts a lot of effort and work into being a part of a band. The things he plays really complement the vocals, the vocal melodies and the harmonies and the song. I mean, he's playing to serve the song, and that's pretty brilliant when you listen to the Cars. I mean, they're such a great pop band, and a huge part of that is that guitar sound of his. Now I'm going to talk about guitar players that there were two of them, sort of like, George Harrison and John Lennon complemented each other so perfectly. George Harrison was skilled, meticulous. John Lennon, on the other hand, was rougher and played with a little bit more aggression. So those are two guitar players that I'm not going to put on my list because they're on everyone's list. I'm going to talk about people that don't really get talked about too much. Like Tom Verlaine gets talked about, but Tom Verlaine and Richard Lloyd, the two guys from Television, a band called Television, they play the first out. If you love music and guitar playing, that part of the music, get that first Television album. Get Marquee Moon. That is a classic album. The songs are incredible. I listened to that album. It's on medium rotation here at the headquarters, and the interplay between the two guitar players is fantastic. Tom Verlaine, Richard Lloyd, they played overlapping, intertwining parts in they didn't use a whole lot of distortion. There's distortion there, of course, a little overdrive and that kind of sound, but they weren't like Ramones level. They came out of that sort of New York punk scene, the CBGB scene, but like the Talking Heads, they were in a separate. They weren't in the punk rock thing. Television wasn't necessarily like the angry punk rockers, but their guitar sound has less aggression to it, but more of that kind of Baroque chamber pop feel to it, without being Baroque or chamber pop, if that makes any sense. They played together in the way that a chamber orchestra plays together. A lot of musical interplay, they link up together, and there were a lot of things that you listen to one and you listen to the other, and the way they're playing together is so perfect, so brilliantly done. Another duo that I've always liked is Black Francis and Joey Santiago of the Pixies. Now that is post-punk, sort of well after the punk era, but they had an aggression to that music. Black Francis is one of those howling singers who is deceptively aggressive. He sounds aggressive. His voice has got that edge to it, but he's very carefully melodic and very musical with his melodies, with his vocal melodies and the melodies of the songs. And likewise with the guitar playing, it may sound slashy and loose and aggressively distorted, but there is a lot going on musically in here. There's a lot of interplay between those two guitar players. Joey Santiago has got this great, almost like a rockabilly vibe, like a haunting hollowness to the sound, like he's playing a hollow body that's just about to feedback, And there is that kind of like they're just about to lose the thread kind of feel to the music, which puts a lot of suspense in the music. The Pixies are fantastic. Just listen to everything the Pixies ever did. That's about it. I mean, there's a few other honorable mentions I'd like to bring in. Fred Frith, not Robert Fripp, but Fred Frith, who put out some albums. He put out a couple of albums on the Ralph Records label, which was a record label run by a band, a sort of a performance art / band called The Residents long ago. They put out 2 albums of his on Ralph Records that are just amazing, fantastic, almost like world music. There's no singing, but the melodies intertwine, they go in and out. It takes you on a journey. I always talk about music that takes me on a journey. I always love that. Fred Frith is great. He goes through, there's a bunch of bands that he was in, Henry Cow, a whole bunch of experimental things that he's done with his guitar treatments, like playing with mallets and things like that. But there's always a foundation of musicality to his playing. He is incredibly diverse player, Fred Frith. Bill Nelson, another great guitar player. He was a guitar slinging sort of rock god of the glam era, popular in his band Bebop Deluxe, and then he went on to sort of morph into various other modes in his career. But his guitar playing has always been a constant, and it's always been the absolute best quality guitar playing. He knows exactly what to play and where to play it and for how long to hold the note. He's one of those guitar players to study. His work with Bebop Deluxe is incredible. There's epic guitar solos, great rhythm playing, fun to learn his songs. And he sang, and a lot of the stuff he was playing was really complicated with what he was singing, which is always difficult to play certain kinds of music and sing at the same time. Bill Nelson with Bebop Deluxe, fantastic guitar work all through that band. Another guitar player that I really love and want to mention worked also with that band, the Residents, that I mentioned earlier. They were a strange, not for everyone kind of a musical group that did very strange music in their early days. And it's not like rock and roll or new wave or punk rock or pop or anything like that. They deconstructed pop songs. They took albums that, you can tell they listened to the Beatles and they grew up like everyone else did. But then they sort of took those songs apart. It's almost like disassembling a work of art, like taking the Mona Lisa or something and taking it apart and then rebuilding it out of Lego or something, and then putting it back in the frame. You have the kind of resembles the Mona Lisa, and in that way, the Residents kind of resemble pop music, but it is so far away from what you might expect. But they had a guitar player who worked with them in their early days, who went by the name of Snakefinger. And his real name was Philip Lithman, and unfortunately he has passed away. But he had solo albums that he did that were incredible. The work he did with the Residents is great. Some of the guitar parts he did, he used an octave multiplier pedal on much of what he did, which gave his sound, his guitar, a certain sound that sounded like two guitars playing at the same time. And but he wrote some incredible songs, some really strange pop songs, pop-inspired songs. They're inspired by pop, but he did them his own way. The rhythms and the choices of how to play the guitar, the way the guitar sounds, not like anybody else. But I highly recommend searching out the work of Snakefinger. It might not be up your alley, but fantastic stuff. I really like Snakefinger. That's about it for now. I could go on and on, about the classic guitar players, Jimmy Page and Brian May and Jimi Hendrix and all the folks that we really like. I mean, there's people like Jimmy Nolan, who played for James Brown, who I really like, and I could go on and on. I have to stop right here. This is like getting a bit too long. But guitar players, I might come back to this topic and bring up a bunch more guitar players that maybe you haven't heard of, maybe you have. People to explore if you're into guitar playing and how the guitar can be used in music. How to use a guitar to make music that isn't just a guitar player trying to sound like his idol. Like somebody trying to sound like Eric Clapton or whatever. But someone who's taking that guitar and trying to figure out new ways to pull music out of those 6 strings or those 12 strings or however many. And that's what fascinates me, when someone at this point in history, or even 20, 30 years ago, was able to do something new with such an old instrument that has been played. I mean, how many albums, how many music songs, pop songs have had a guitar player on it? you can't even count that high. I think it's more than there are particles in the universe. So how do you take something that's used that much, that overused? Some people might think, people probably 100 years ago were saying the guitar is played out. There's no further use for it. Everything that can be done has been done. But no, people still come up with cool ways to use that instrument, that thing. It's an iconic thing that you must hold when you're on the rock and roll stage. It's a weapon. It's a body part extension. It's a iconic, graven image. It's a idol. It's such a symbol and such a thing of popular music. It's hard to avoid them. And I don't want to avoid them. So I love guitars. I love playing guitars. And I think that's all I'm going to say about guitars in this guitar episode of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you again real soon.